The wind screamed across the moor like it was trying to rip the sky off the ground. Snow hit the windows of Nell Hartley's cottage from the side, covering the orchard beyond. The apple trees, which used to look proud and bare in the winter, were now bent over by the weight of thick, sticky ice. This storm was the worst in years. Nell pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and lit another candle inside the cottage. The power went out just after noon, and the backup generator died an hour later. The last ember in the fireplace broke softly, casting a tired light over her boots and the rug. She let out a sigh. She had been through storms alone before. It wouldn't be the last. But this one felt different. More angry. She took a deep breath, put on her parka, buttoned it up, and went outside into the cold. The path to the barn was almost impossible to see because it was covered in a foot of new snow. She walked slowly, using one gloved hand to touch the mossy stone wall for balance. Her boots slipped on a patch of ice as she rounded the bend by the orchard's edge. She hit the wall and stopped. Someone was lying there. A person was slumped against the old stones, which were half covered in snow. A guy. His coat was ripped, and there was blood on his face near his temple. One of his legs was bent in a strange way. Nell's heart raced in her throat. For one awful second, she thought he was dead. Then there was movement. A short breath. A quick blink of his eyes. She fell to her knees. "Hey, do you hear me?" He groaned but didn't say anything. "Damn it!" She looked around. There was no one for miles around. "Is there cell service out here?" "Don't worry about it." She had to use all of her strength to lift him up. He was tall, had broad shoulders, and was heavy with wet clothes. She half dragged and half carried him along the slippery path, through the barn door, and into the stable, where the warmth from her old mare's stall was still there. The dim light of a kerosene lantern inside showed a face that was pale from the cold and hair that was damp and curled at the ends. His cheeks were sore from the wind. She put him on a pile of old blankets and struggled to take off his coat and boots to get the blood flowing. He didn't fight back. Just took a breath. It was almost half an hour later when he moved again. He jumped up in surprise. "Whoa, slow down," she said, holding out her hand. "You fell. You're safe. This is my barn." His eyes were sharp and careful as they looked into hers. "Where am I?" "Moorcrest. Edge of the West. Nell Hartley is the name. I found you outside, half dead." He winced when he touched the blood on his head. "Jonah, Reed." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that your real name?" He smiled a little. "Most days." She didn't laugh. "You got ID?" "Not at all. Figures." For a while, they sat in silence, tense. Outside, the snow kept hitting the walls. Finally, she got up. "I have dry blankets and tea at home. Can you walk?" He nodded slowly. "I'll be fine." She started a small fire inside and made 2 cups of tea that were only slightly warm. He held the cup in his hands like it was gold. She said, "You don't live here, no. You don't talk much, do you?" "No." Another long break. She looked at him closely. He was too neat to be a homeless person and too tough to be a traveler who got stuck in the snow. His hands, which were now bare, told their own story. They had thick calluses on the palms that you don't get from typing or hiking. These were hands for riding. Hands that work. "Those are the hands of a horseman," she said. He looked down. "I used to work with horses." She didn't push. He got up without saying a word, picked up a broken-handled axe by the fireplace, and went outside. Nell stood there, confused, and looked out the window. As the snow got darker, she watched him break up her woodpile, stack the logs in neat piles, and bring them inside. "Don't you need to rest?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Can't sit still." That night, she saw him quietly fixing her old rain slicker with a needle and thread that she didn't even remember leaving out. A big tear in the back that was sewn up with care by a surgeon. "You didn't need to do that. I saw that it was ripped." She squinted her eyes. "Do you always fix other people's clothes?" He didn't say anything. Kept sewing. That feeling of unease she had before was still there. But something else had started to flash beneath it. A strange, unwilling warmth. She wasn't used to being around people. Not men at all. Not since Gareth, for sure. "You can sleep in the loft," she finally said, pointing to the stairs that led to the attic. "There are blankets." He stood up, nodded once, and then climbed. She sat back down and stared into the fire after she heard the floorboards creak above. She could hear the storm banging on the windows like it was mad it had lost him. Reed, Jonah. No ID. Hands that are calloused. She fixed her raincoat like it was important. And no regular hiker goes past the orchard wall. Not for nothing. The storm had calmed down to a quiet hush by the next morning. A white shroud covered the hills, making the moor's sharp edges look softer. Nell woke up to the smell of wood smoke and the strange sight of neatly stacked fresh kindling next to the fireplace. The stove was already warm from the kettle. She blinked in the soft light of the kitchen and listened. There are footsteps outside. She walked to the door and opened it. Jonah was there, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and a shovel in hand, carefully clearing the snow from the path between the house and the barn. He didn't say anything. He just stopped for a second, nodded, and kept working. For a moment, she looked at him. The man didn't belong here, but he acted like he had been living here for years. She stepped outside, her boots crunching on the path he had made, and her breath hung in the cold air. You didn't have to do all this. I was awake. I thought I'd help. She looked at him. You're not just a hiker passing through. He didn't respond. The sound of tires skidding reached her ears before she could press. She spun around. A truck that had seen better days drove up the icy road. George and Lorraine Whitby lived 2 hills away and were always too loud and too much information. George called out as he stepped outside. Well, we heard you lost power. I brought you some candles and the herbal tea you like. Nell nodded. That's nice of you. Lorraine got out more slowly, her eyes already on Jonah. Who is this, then? A traveler, Nell said shortly. Got caught in the storm. Well, isn't that something? Lorraine said, and the question that wasn't spoken hung in the air. She gave him a tin. Snow knocked down trees along the old cart path. The council says it will take them a week to clear it. George spoke up. Have you heard the latest about Moorcrest? Nell let out a sigh. What do I do now? They're getting ready to turn in plans for that new eco-lodge. Green tourism, walking trails, and all that other fancy advertising. Her jaw got tight. That thought died years ago. Not quite, George said as he leaned on his cane. They want to open up the south access again, the one that goes right along the fence of your orchard. Lorraine got closer. They would have to cross your land, right? Nell's mouth got dry. That path hasn't been used in years. It isn't public. George said, that's what Moorcrest is trying to say. All for the public good. The town council loves it. Counselor that CEO and Pritchard himself walked the property. I think it was just last week, Conrad Vale. Nell's heart raced. What? On the line of my fence? That's what they say. Again, Lorraine's eyes darted over to Jonah. You sure chose an interesting time to have a guest. Nell gave her a warning look. He's not my guest. He's just going to stay until the road is clear. Jonah nodded at George. Are you good with snow shovels, son? Jonah grunted once to show he understood and went back to clearing the last few feet of the path. Okay then, George said, clapping his hands together. We're leaving. Roads are hard to get through. Lorraine's head stayed in the window like a hawk watching from a branch as they drove away. Nell stood still, and snow piled up on her shoulders. Jonah came back and put the shovel against the barn wall. They've got everyone in the village talking, she said. I got it. She stared at him. Do you believe them? Jonah used his sleeve to wipe his forehead. Doesn't matter if I do. You do. She looked across the orchard at the old fence line. Her husband's family had owned that land for a long time. Gareth's great-grandfather built the stone walls by hand. After Gareth died, even when the debts were about to take her life, Nell never thought about giving it up. Now they wanted to cover it up in the name of progress. Public good, she said with anger. It's funny how it always seems to cost the little guy everything. Jonah didn't say anything, but she could tell something had changed behind his eyes. Not pity. Another thing. That night, the snow froze into hard plates all over the orchard. Nell couldn't get to sleep. She made tea and stared at the old deeds she kept in a drawer by the stove because her fingers were itching to do something. No information about public rights of way. Nothing is clear, anyway. She turned around when Jonah came into the kitchen, as usual. Do you need something? I heard the kettle. She gave him a cup without asking. For a moment, they were quiet. He said, You've been here a long time. Since I married Gareth. For almost 20 years. He slowly nodded. And you want to keep it? She got angry. Of course I do. We should then start to figure out how. She was surprised when she looked at him. We? He looked her in the eye and stayed calm. I've seen land taken before. All it takes is one wrong move or one missed meeting for it to be gone. You don't want to be 2 steps behind them. She looked at him, not sure. Why do you care? He drank his tea. Let's just say, I don't like people who pick on others. She squinted. You sound like someone whose land has been stolen. I talk like I've been there. Again and again. She turned away, suddenly tired. I don't need another man to tell me how to keep what's mine. I'm not going to tell you, he said in a calm voice. I'm willing to help. She didn't say anything. Later that night, she stopped by the window that looked out over the fence line as she went up the stairs. There are tire tracks in the snow just past the orchard. 2 sets. Going to the far gate. She leaned in closer, her heart racing. Someone had already come here. The morning after she found the tire tracks, Nell stepped outside into the cold air with her jaw set and her heart racing. The white coat on the orchard made it look peaceful, but to her, it felt wrong. Someone had walked on her land without asking. Most likely Councillor Pritchard. That sneaky CEO, Conrad Vale, maybe. She clenched her teeth and walked to the barn. The water pump behind it had broken down again. That meant the horses wouldn't get any water unless she carried it by hand from the stream. With an angry grunt, she kicked the frozen pipe. Jonah came out of the barn with his coat zipped up to his chin and his hat pulled down. Problems? Pump's frozen, she said quietly. It does this when the temperature drops too quickly. Show me. She thought about it. Do you know anything about plumbing? A little. He crouched next to the old hand pump and carefully looked over the fittings. He ran his fingers along the pipe and then stood up and walked along it until he reached the main valve, which was sticking out of the ground. This was added later, wasn't it? He asked. Yes, Gareth tried to make it more modern. We couldn't pay for full winterization. Jonah didn't say anything. He went into the barn and came back a few minutes later with a bunch of tools that Nell didn't even know she still had, a pipe wrench, a thermal wrap, and some insulation padding from the old feed room. With her arms crossed, she watched him work. He moved with calm precision, unscrewing connections, wrapping the pipe in insulation, and slowly warming the base with a rusty blowtorch. She said, You've done this before. Couple winters in Alberta. Fixing broken water lines and worse cold than this. Did that happen before or after you started walking around the country without ID? He looked up at her, his lips twitching. Do you think I'm up to something again? Never stopped. He didn't say anything. The pipe hissed, coughed, and then gurgled to life in less than 20 minutes. The spout made a sputtering sound, and then a steady stream of water flowed into the bucket. Nell blinked. You fixed it. Jonah got up and wiped his hands on a rag. Just for now. The fittings have rust on them. In the spring, you'll have to change the intake valve. She slowly let out a breath. Thanks. He nodded and turned to put the tools away, but she kept looking at him. This man was who? Too skilled. Not loud enough. Too calm when things get tough. Not a hiker. Not a lost person. They ate soup together in the kitchen that afternoon. She had heated the pot over the fireplace because the power had not come back on. The room smelled good because of the lentils and carrots cooking, which warmed more than just the air. Their elbows were almost touching as they sat at the table. Nell reached for the ladle at the same time as Jonah, and their fingers touched. She quickly pulled back. I'm sorry, she said. He smiled just a little bit. It's okay. She cleared her throat and dipped the spoon. Not used to being around people. I thought so. They ate without talking. The wind rattled the window panes again outside, but the snow had finally stopped. Jonah got up after they were done and grabbed his coat by the door. I'm going to walk along the north fence. Why? Making sure no one else has been snooping around. She thought about it for a second and then nodded. There is an old Ashbourne crest on the far gate. A big iron badge. A lot of people don't even notice it. Jonah's hand stopped on the handle of the door. Is Ashbourne? Yeah. Gareth's family said it came from an old estate boundary. No one really knows where it came from. He didn't say anything and left. Nell leaned against the windowsill and poured herself another cup of tea. She had never given that crest much thought. It was just another rusty sign that had been forgotten in the snow and hedge. But Jonah's reaction had changed the mood in the room. She knew it. He still hadn't come back by late afternoon. She put on her coat and boots and carefully walked through the knee-high drifts to the north boundary. He was standing perfectly still by the gate when she got there. His scarf and shoulders were covered in snow. He was staring at the crest. There was a round iron sign, about 6 inches wide, bolted to the gatepost. A faded design, 2 antlers crossed over a shield, with a faint outline of a raven above it. You know what it is, don't you? She said softly behind him. He didn't look. It's the Ashbourne family crest. You don't see many of those these days. Are you sure? He finally did turn. Yeah. She looked at him. And how do you know that for sure? He let out a slow breath, as if he were thinking about something. I worked on a few old estates in my time. You pick these things up. She didn't trust him. Not completely. But she didn't push. They walked back together, quiet as the sun went down. She lay in bed later that night, unable to sleep. She lay on her back and listened to the crackling of the fire below. She wondered what secrets Jonah Reed had brought with him to her orchard. She got up and walked down the stairs without shoes. Jonah was awake in the parlor, sitting in the armchair with a book she hadn't seen in years, The Land Records of Northern Yorkshire. She stopped in the doorway. You can't sleep either? She asked. He didn't look up. Just reading. You seem to know a lot about this area. I pay attention. She squinted. You didn't just happen to find my orchard, Jonah. There was a reason you came here. He finally turned to her. And for a second, the mask came off. But it came back just as quickly. I needed a quiet place. That's it. She put her arms across her chest. And the fact that you saw an old crest buried in snow is just a coincidence? He got up. Good night, Nell. He walked past her and up the stairs, leaving her alone. But she wasn't cold anymore. She was on fire. The letter was wrapped in crisp manila paper and had the blue and green logo of the Moorcrest planning office on it, which was cold and bureaucratic. Nell found it on her front stoop just after sunrise, where it was half buried in a thin layer of frost. No stamp. Someone had given it to them in person. She looked at the envelope for a long time before bringing it inside. Her hands were already shaking. Inside, folded up with surgical precision, was a 5-page notice written in legalese that smelled like ink and death. Notice of consultation. Proposed development of right-of-way. Moorcrest Green Developments Limited is the applicant. Location: the southern edge is next to Hartley Orchard. Request: confirmation of public access based on past use. A compulsory purchase order, CPO, that needs to be approved. She read it twice, and with each line, her heart sank lower. Then again. And again. There was a map at the bottom of the last page. It cut right through her orchard. Not just a long path by the gate, but right through the middle of her land. Over the barn. Over the press shed. Like a cut made by a surgeon, right down the middle. Like they already had it. She threw the papers down on the table. Jonah, she yelled up the stairs, you have to see this. He slowly came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes and half-buttoning his shirt. She gave him the papers and pushed them into his hands. He read without saying a word, and with each paragraph, his jaw got tighter. His thumb stopped on the CPO line. Are they already talking about forced purchase? They're calling it a precautionary clause. They said they're talking to the town lawyer. He put the papers down and looked at her. This is bad. You think I don't know that? He looked at the map again with his eyes. They've already made plans for the roads. This isn't an exploration, so. It's planned. Now she was pacing with her hands and fists. They're going to take it. The orchard. The only thing I still have. Did you know that Garris family planted the oldest row in 1902? They grew apples in this valley before there was electricity. Jonah's voice was steady. They haven't taken it yet. They will. These people, like Conrad Vale and Councillor Pritchard, they don't ask. They put on pressure. They use tricks. He didn't say anything. She stopped walking around. You said you've seen this happen before. What do they do? He let out a breath. They wait until the landowner is too busy. Then they make a generous settlement offer. If that doesn't work, they ask the council for a CPO. A lot of people give up. They can't afford to go to court. Her voice broke. I can't buy anything. Jonah was quiet for a moment, then said in a low voice, let me ask around. I know someone who might be able to help with this. She glanced at him. Who should I ask? He looked her in the eye, calm but hard to read. People who owe me favors. You're still not being honest with me. I'm here to help. You can take it or leave it. She thought about it. Her pride wanted to kick him out. But her gut told her something else. Okay, she said. But what if this goes wrong? It won't. That afternoon, Jonah left the village under the pretense of needing hardware supplies. Nell went to the post office to see if anyone else had gotten the same notices. The cold made the air brittle, and the snow squeaked when you walked on it. When she got to the town square, her coat blew in the wind. She ran into Ruth Chapman, the church secretary, and old Mrs. Pendle inside the store. Mrs. Pendle was already complaining about the road closures. "Did you hear?" Ruth asked, not even waiting for an answer. "Hey, Nell, they want to run a road through your orchard. Everyone in the village is talking." "I heard," Nell said in a dry voice. Mrs. Pendle said, "They say it's part of the Eco-Lodge vision. More like greenwashing. Concrete and glass on top of wetlands and heritage." Then, when things were quiet, the postmaster put something in Nell's hand. He whispered, "There is no name on the sender, but said it was for you." She took it home, her heart racing, and opened it at the table in her kitchen. There was a stapled brochure inside called Moorcrest Ecovision, Internal Stakeholder Edition. It had been printed in full color on glossy pages, but someone had circled parts of it in red pen. Page 7. The main access road will come in from the southern boundary, which is currently private but up for negotiation. Page 9. Councillor Pritchard went to the site with Conrad Vale, and they all agreed that it was likely to be approved. Page 11. A rendering of shiny cabins placed exactly where her apple trees used to be. She let go of the pages like they were on fire. "They've already made up their minds," she said quietly. "This is just a formality." She threw the brochure on the counter when Jonah came back with red cheeks from the wind. "Tell me what this means." He looked at it quickly, and his face got darker. "Someone on the inside told you this." She didn't say anything. "I'm not asking how, I want to know what we do now." He took a chair and slowly sat down. "This shows that they are sure. Sure enough to spend money on marketing and designs. I don't care about how sure they are. I care about my trees and my land." He nodded. "Then we make this public. Go to the village and let them see it before it's too late." She thought for a moment. "You really think the town would support me?" He looked her in the eye and said, "Yes, if they see how far this has gone behind closed doors." For a long time, she didn't answer. Finally, she whispered, "Okay." Jonah stood up to leave again, saying he had to make a call from the village hall payphone. Nell saw something in his coat pocket. A card, faded. It has a crest with 2 antlers and a raven on it. She turned her head before he saw her looking at him. The kettle was cold again. Nell stood by the stove and looked out the window at the spot where Jonah should have been, stacking firewood, walking along the fence line, checking the pipes, and asking questions without asking too many. But that morning, he hadn't come down. There was no sign of him, no note, and no footprints in the snow. He was just gone. She looked in the loft. He also lost his coat and pack. Shit. She slammed the cabinet shut, and the sound echoed through the cottage like a door slamming inside her chest. She didn't know why it hurt so much. He wasn't hers. He wasn't even really her friend. He was just a stranger who had fallen out of the storm and into her barn like a ghost with strong hands and old knowledge. Still, he had left. No farewell. No reason. By noon, she had convinced herself that she didn't care. She had bigger problems, like the orchard and the threat of a forced sale. The CPO documents sat on the edge of the table like a silent threat, as if they were waiting for her to give up. She took out a yellow legal pad instead. It's time to fight back. She started by listing the facts: ownership deeds, orchard boundaries, oral history from Gareth's family, and old land use maps. She flipped through everything she'd inherited but never read. There were stacks of them, dusty legal folders, old typewritten documents, and notes in Gareth's handwriting that she hadn't seen in years. At first, the words blurred. But the more she read, the clearer her mind became. Patterns emerged. Names she knew. Survey lines. Dates. There were maps and open files all over her kitchen by the time the sun went down. The wind rattled the shutters again, but this time it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like movement. The next day, she made real calls. To the council office. To a lawyer in the village who owed her father a favor. To Mrs. Whitby, who had always been good at finding out about town gossip and municipal drama. Nell asked the question she had never thought to ask before. Who gave the go-ahead for the site visit? Were there minutes from the planning committee? Who was Conrad Vale? The answers didn't make her feel better. Everything about the Moorcrest Lodge project was going too fast. It was like they had already made up their minds months ago and were just going through the motions now. You know, the kind of thing people do when they think no one is watching. She was watching now, though. 3 days went by without a word from Jonah. She didn't see him or hear from him. She asked around the village, first casually and then more directly. Dark coat? A little quiet? Mr. Whitby asked. Tall guy? Yes. He left the bar on Tuesday. It looked like he was going to Whitfell Road. Nell blinked. That road is closed. The snow melted and washed it out. Exactly, Whitby said, frowning. Nell sat by the fire with a cup of brandy and absent-mindedly scrolled through the local news on her old laptop. The signal was bad and the pages took a long time to load. She clicked on the Yorkshire Observer and saw a headline that caught her eye. What happened to Viscount Ashbourne? People are surprised by the Society Vanishing Act. She clicked and her chest tightened. The article didn't have many facts but a lot of guesses. Sebastian Ashbourne, 34, the heir to the now-defunct Ashbourne estate and known recluse, had missed two big events in London. The last confirmed sighting was weeks ago at a charity gala. Since then, nothing. His estate house was empty, his staff gave vague answers, and his lawyer refused to comment. There was a picture in the middle of the article. She got closer. It was him. But not Jonah. He was clean-shaven, wearing a tailored coat and scarf, and walking next to a sleek black car in the picture. His bone structure and watchful eyes were the same, but the air was different. It was tighter, as if he were wearing a version of himself. No. She looked at the screen for a long time. The name Sebastian Ashbourne sounded like something old. She stood up quickly and went outside into the cold. She walked past the barn, through the orchard, and straight to the old gate. The iron crest was rusty and there was two antlers. A raven on top of a shield. He was sure of what it was. He hadn't stepped onto her property. He had gone back to it. Nell didn't wait for answers the next day. She went straight to the town hall with a thick file under her arm and walked into the planning office like she belonged there. "Miss Hartley," the secretary said, surprised. "We weren't expecting." "I'm not here for coffee. I'm here to file a complaint." "About what?" The secretary blinked. "The Moorcrest application. Section 4B. Proposed easement through private land." "My land. You'll need to make an appointment." "Then put me on the list." "I'm not going anywhere." She spent the rest of the morning going over blueprints, asking for copies of all the papers filed under the application number, and demanding to know when public consultations would be held. By noon, she had a list of problems, including one strange difference in the map overlays. She no longer felt powerless. But as she walked home through the falling sleet, a part of her was still angry. Sebastian, not Jonah, had lied to her. She had faith in him. Not completely, but enough. And he left as soon as things got serious. Or maybe he didn't leave. Someone might not have wanted him there. There had never been so many people in the village hall before. When Nell Hartley walked into the room, the smell of wet wool, old wood, and paper programs filled the air. The storm outside had forced everyone inside, but the real thunder was in the form of planning boards pinned to the stage, with glossy pictures of the Moorcrest Eco Lodge project shining under cheap fluorescent lights. Someone had made them really big, 5 feet wide. There were color-coded access roads, green trails, and happy tourists playing next to wind turbines and wood-fired hot tubs. On every poster, the access road curved perfectly across her orchard. As Councillor Pritchard stepped up to the mic, she stood in the back and went unnoticed. He started with a calm, polished voice. "Thank you all for coming. This project will bring Moorcrest much-needed money, jobs, and eco-friendly tourism. It will also bring modern infrastructure, and all of it was planned with nature in mind." People in the crowd murmured in agreement. Nell's heart raced. At first, she hadn't come here to argue. She had come to listen, watch, and take notes. But when she saw that road again, like a knife cutting through her family's land, something inside her broke. Pritchard kept talking. "We know there are concerns about access to the southern boundary. I want to make it clear that this is a matter of public interest, not individual obstruction. The path is shown on historical usage maps." Nell said, "That's not true." It wasn't a shout, but it was loud enough to cut through the air like a clean break. Everyone looked. "Excuse me." Pritchard blinked. She moved forward, and the sound of her boots on the wood floor echoed. "The historical usage you're talking about was an old carriage road that only the Ashbourne estate used. It was never open to the public, and you know it." A few gasps. A rustle of voices in the air. Pritchard got better quickly. "Miss Hartley, we understand your personal connection." "No," she said. "You don't get it." Now the room was quiet. She cleared her throat and felt the heat rise to her cheeks. "You guys had closed-door meetings and drew a road through land that isn't yours. You didn't ask. You thought I wouldn't fight back." Whitby, who was sitting near the middle row, whistled softly. "She's right. We didn't hear anything about this until your fancy brochures showed up at the pub. Another person nodded and said, they sent the survey team out before the public consultation even started. A third voice said, and what about the wetland buffer? Pritchard put his hands up and said, please, everyone, let's keep this civil. Then a new voice came from the back. It was calm, clear, and familiar. You'll need to fix the record, counselor. Nell turned quickly. He was there. No, Jonah. Sebastian. He stood at the back of the room in a dark wool coat, no longer in barn clothes. He was clean-shaven and his hair was neatly combed back. His presence cut through the air like a knife. People turned to look, and a few whispered his name, recognizing the face from society columns, old estate legends, or maybe even gossip whispered across fence lines. Pritchard stopped moving. Viscount Ashbourne? Sebastian stepped forward and said, that road runs through what is left of the Ashbourne estate, which I still own. The deeds haven't changed in over 150 years. It was never made public, leased, or annexed. For a brief moment, Pritchard lost his cool. That may be disputed by recent archival. Sebastian said, I've already had a lawyer look over the tithe maps. We also have a full copy of the 1832 estate survey. It is, and always has been, private. Someone clapped. Then one more. Nell stood still as he walked toward her, not paying attention to the group of shocked council members who were whispering behind Pritchard. He said quietly, so only she could hear, I didn't come here to talk, but when I saw the new designs, I couldn't keep quiet. She whispered back, you disappeared. I needed to know how far they were willing to go. She looked at him, not sure if she should hit him or thank him. The meeting turned into a mess, with dozens of people talking over each other, fights breaking out in the corner, and a couple from the northern farms demanding to see the soil reports. Sebastian stepped aside and let the storm swirl around them. Nell said, you should have told me who you were. I couldn't. Why not? He thought for a moment. Because the Ashbourne name doesn't open doors anymore. It closes them. Well, you made me think you were just some drifter, she said with her arms crossed. I had to see what they were doing to this valley and your orchard without a title in the way. You lied. I kept a part of myself quiet, he said. But everything else, my offer to help, fixing the pump, the nights in the barn, those were real. She turned away. You could have told me. I'm giving you a warning now. Enough, Pritchard said as he hit the gavel. The room got quiet. But the harm had already been done. Sebastian turned to the people and spoke louder. For the record, I plan to file legal notice tomorrow saying that there is no easement on that boundary. I will also start the process of designating part of the land as a conservation trust. That means no commercial development. Not now. Not ever. A cheer went up that was sharp, sudden, and real. Whitby stood up and clapped harder. About damn time. Pritchard looked like he had eaten a lemon. And Nell just stood there with her chest tight, not sure if she wanted to run, cry, or shake the man next to her until he told her everything. But all she could say was, thank you. 2 days later, the lawyer showed up in a black four-wheel drive with a leather case and boots covered in London grit. Her name was Frances Avery, and she had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. Her accent was so clipped that it could cut paper. She greeted Nell at the gate with a nod and a handshake that felt like a contract. You're Hartley, she said. The owner of the orchard. That's right. And you're ready to stop Moorcrest? Nell thought about it for a moment before saying, I am good. I don't want to lose clients. There were maps and papers all over the kitchen table, like a military operation. Frances took out 19th century tithe maps, estate ledgers, surveyors' notebooks, and a pile of papers that looked much older than anything Nell had ever seen. Sebastian stood at the head of the table with his coat off and sleeves rolled up. He was no longer hiding. When Frances called him Lord Ashbourne, he didn't flinch. He didn't shrink from the weight of the legacy his name carried. In fact, he looked like a man who had finally found his place. Frances pointed to a faded line on the map and said, the original carriageway was listed under Ashbourne control going back to 1823. It was never opened to the public. The 1957 infrastructure records are missing, most likely conveniently lost during land transitions, but we found the 1881 estate plat map. That trumps all. Nell leaned in and asked. They can't even park a wheelbarrow on it without Sebastian's permission, Frances said. And as for the orchard, Sebastian said, I'll protect it, forever. Frances looked at him and said, I've written a conservation covenant. It says that the land is agricultural heritage. Once it's signed and recorded with the council, no developer can touch it. Nell looked at the parchment. And what about the road? We'll cut it off at the source, Francis said. The only way in was through your fence and the old Ashbourne Lane. Now that that's blocked, Moorcrest is legally stuck. For a long time, Nell just stood there, taking it all in. She wasn't used to getting what she wanted. The next morning, they met again, this time in the village solicitor's office, a small brick building between the butcher and the charity shop. A few townspeople were outside, whispering like the wind around corners. Everyone knew. The Viscount was fighting back. With her. The papers were waiting inside. Frances put the conservation covenant on the desk. It's public record once you sign, she said. Sebastian nodded, took the pen, and slowly wrote his name, Sebastian Alden Ashbourne, with each letter looping around to end. The deed of grant was the second document that came. Sebastian said to Nell, "This easement makes sure that you and any future owner can legally cross my land. No one can ever argue with it." Nell's throat got tight. "Why?" "Because you stood your ground when I was hiding behind a fake name," he said. "Because you taught me that land is more than just property. It's blood and memory." She looked at the paper, then at him. This is forever." He said softly, "Yes, and it's yours." She put her name on the line. A group had gathered by the square when they stepped out into the cold sunlight. Whitby was there with his arms crossed, and his wife was next to him. Ruth from the church, the Pendles, and even a few council members who had been suspiciously quiet until now were also there. Sebastian moved forward and held up the signed papers. He said, "I've sent both the Conservation Covenant and the Deed of Grant to the Moorcrest Council Registry. Starting now, no commercial development can happen on or through the Hartley Orchard. Also, no road can be built through Ashbourne lands without breaking historical easement law." There was a cheer. Whitby made a fist. "That's the way, son." But the applause stopped when Sebastian raised a hand. "I know what some of you think," he said. "That the Ashbournes were absentee landowners who sat in their manor houses and let other people fight for what was important." He turned to Nell. "I was one of them. I ran from all of it. From legacy. From responsibility. I thought that silence made me safe. It didn't. A break." The crowd was paying attention now. A storm, a barn, and a woman with more guts than I've ever had made me remember who I really was. People turned to look at Nell. She got embarrassed but didn't look away. Sebastian went on. "I'm not here to take back power. I'm here to give it back. I'm going to work with the County Preservation Board to set up a community land trust. The Ashbourne estate will be open to the public as an educational site, with Nell in charge of our new program for kids and environmental outreach." He showed them a rough drawing of rows of fruit trees, bee gardens, and forest paths. The Ravensby Orchard and Bee Path. Another wave of whispers, then applause. The moment was heavy and full of hope. When the crowd left, Nell was next to him under the oak tree outside the lawyer's office. The wind pulled at her hair. "You really meant all that?" she asked softly. "Every word. I'm not a symbol, Sebastian. I know. You don't have to pay me back." He looked at her and said, "Maybe not, but I still want to give something back." She paused. "You're not what I thought you would be." He smiled and said, "You too." The clouds were getting thinner and the sky above was a pale gold. The air felt cleaner and lighter. And for the first time in a long time, Nell didn't feel like the world was closing in on her. She felt like she was just starting to breathe. They didn't take long. 2 days after Sebastian filed the Conservation Covenant and signed the Deed of Grant, a black Mercedes rolled into the village square like it owned the road. The kind of car that looked out of place on Moorcrest's muddy lanes and frostbitten cobblestone. From the back emerged Lady Imogen Ashbourne, draped in navy wool, pearls tight at her throat, gloves so pristine they could have been painted on. She didn't glance at the villagers gathering to watch. She didn't have to. Her chin alone spoke for her. Councillor Pritchard was already at the chapel steps, standing straight with papers under his arm. They walked into the village hall together, where Moorcrest's legal team had called another community meeting. Nell sat in the second row with her arms crossed and her jaw clenched. Sebastian, who was next to her, hardly moved. His shoulders were square, but his eyes were far away. The hall quickly filled up. When Lady Imogen walked up to the podium, no one said anything except for a few mumbled hellos out of politeness. She didn't smile. She put one gloved hand on the microphone and started talking like she was talking to a group of bad kids in a classroom. She said, "I'm here today not for a ceremony, but to correct things." Nell felt the first pangs of heat rise in her stomach. Lady Imogen went on, her voice ringing with practiced calm. For generations, discipline, tradition, and discretion have been the hallmarks of this estate, Ashbourne, Moorcrest, and the surrounding lands. Unfortunately, some hasty choices made in the last few days threatened to ruin that legacy. She looked at Sebastian without saying his name. The message was clear. Heirs have duties, she said. Not just to land, but to order, families, and reputations. Sebastian didn't move. The knife came next. And while some people in this room may believe in romantic ideas of resistance, she said, looking at Nell now, I suggest they look at their own records more closely before saying they are morally superior. Nell squinted her eyes and asked, what does that mean? Lady Imogen smiled, but not very much. I mean that financial histories don't go away. Not even when a husband dies. Counselor Pritchard, if you would. Pritchard stepped up and opened a folder like a magician showing off a trap. He said, according to archived records, Gareth Hartley, Miss Nell Hartley's deceased husband, failed to pay his land taxes on time several times between 2006 and 2009. He also took out a short-term equity loan using part of the orchard as collateral. Documents show that the repayment was never formally completed. A low murmur went through the crowd. Nell's blood ran cold. She said, that loan was paid off. We refinanced it and sold the north paddock. Pritchard shrugged. The bank statements don't show a closure. Lady Imogen leaned into the mic. I'm afraid that what Miss Hartley thinks is settled is still open to interpretation by law. And now that recent covenants have been filed, these financial uncertainties could get in the way of legitimate development that is meant to benefit the whole community. Benefit? Nell asked as she stood up. You mean profit for you? Imogen said sharply. We mean progress and stability. The Ashbourne name used to mean those things. Sebastian stood up next to Nell. You don't speak for the Ashbourne name anymore. Lady Imogen slowly turned. Don't I? No, he said. You speak for yourself. For backroom deals, cover-ups, and legacy as a weapon. I'm not hiding behind it. I'm trying to fix what you used to control people for decades. You think you know how to control? I used to, he said. Now I know what freedom is. Imogen's face didn't change, but her eyes were on fire. This is a disaster you made. And then, a voice came from behind. I have copies. When a local reporter stepped forward with a phone in one hand and a printed email thread in the other, everyone in the room turned. She said, my name is Laura Hayes. I filed a Freedom of Information request last month. It took some work, but I got it. Imogen's face didn't move much, but Pritchard's jaw got tight. Laura went on, these are emails between Counselor Pritchard, Conrad Vale of Moorcrest Developments, and Lady Imogen's secretary. They set up a private assurance that the south access would be approved, no matter what the land status was, as long as covenant delays were blocked. The crowd went crazy. Chairs moving, yelling, cursing. Pritchard tried to say something. This is out of context. Is that your signature? Laura asked angrily as she held out the printed copy. He didn't say anything. Nell stood still, her heart racing. Then Whitby slowly stood up and said, that's enough. Others came after. One by one. Some of the oldest people first, then some farmers, the schoolteacher, and Ruth from the church, who stood next to her. Whitby said, we don't want your lodge. Lady Imogen's voice got louder, tighter, and angrier. Do you think this little show will last? Do you think the voices of peasants can change the legacy? But no one did. Nell stood in the middle of it all and looked at her without fear. Legacy isn't yours anymore, she said. Lady Imogen looked at her as if she might say something again, but she never did. She turned, fists clenched, and walked straight out of the hall. Pritchard followed, looking pale and quiet. The wind outside had started to change. The snow had turned into soft mud by the time they got to the lawyer's office together. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind when most of the village was still drinking tea or scraping ice off their cars' windshields. But inside the little brick building on High Street, history was about to change. Sebastian held the envelope with the original conservation covenant in one hand. It was now stamped and ready to be recorded by the public. His other hand was deep in his coat pocket, and Nell could see his knuckles through the fabric. She hadn't said much that morning. Not since the crowd stood with her at the village hall. Not since Lady Imogen had been shown for who she was. It wasn't that Nell didn't have anything to say. It was that the words had become heavier. They were no longer fragile, but careful. Like the kind of truths you only say when you're sure they'll land. They got to the front desk. The young clerk behind it blinked at the names, signatures, and finality on the papers. He asked, Are you sending both at the same time? Sebastian nodded and said, the deed of grant and the conservation covenant. Nell pulled a small brown folder out of her own coat and handed it to the other person. And the supporting documents, a personal affidavit, photos, and a land use ledger. It's all here. The clerk took it with respect and nodded. I'll make the entry myself, he said. They went back outside into the wind without saying a word. They didn't need to. The orchard was still in the distance. Brown branches, bare soil, and rows of trees waiting for spring. The wind moved through them slowly, like breath or patience. Sebastian stood next to her and looked at the horizon. That's it, he said. They can't touch it now. I know. You saved it, Nell. She looked at him and said, we did. He stopped. He said, there's something I haven't said yet. Not clearly. She raised an eyebrow. That would be different. He said, I came back here because I was lost. Not just because of the Ashbourne name. I was lost in everything. I lived in a house with 50 rooms and couldn't hear my own thoughts in any of them. She looked at him. It wasn't until I was sleeping in your barn with a patch coat and the sound of horses breathing next to me that I finally felt free, he said. She didn't say anything. He looked down. I was running away from who I was. I thought that if I took away everything, my name, my title, my legacy, I could find something worth being again. And did you? She asked. He spoke in a lower voice. I found you. She stared at him for a long time, not with softness but with a clarity that shocked him. Then why did you tell a lie? He flinched a little. He said, I didn't mean to. I told myself I was protecting you from everything, the weight of that name, the politics. But maybe I was just scared. Scared you wouldn't want the truth. Nell let the quiet stay. Then. I don't care what the name is, Sebastian. He raised his head. Who fixed my pump? Who stayed quiet when I needed quiet and stood up when I needed someone next to me, she said. I care about the man who carried firewood without being asked. She moved closer. But if you ever lie to me again, I'll kick you out faster than the storm brought you in. He smiled for a second and said, fair. She reached out her hand and said, so tell me the truth. The whole truth. Right now. All of it. He took a deep breath and then held her hand with both of his. My real name is Sebastian Alden Ashbourne. I was born in the north wing of Ravensby Manor, under a ceiling painted with stars. I went to schools I don't remember, was photographed for events I didn't understand, and got a title I didn't earn. He stopped for a moment. But I never understood land, what it means, until I saw how you fought for yours. She nodded once. And what do you want now? She asked. He didn't think twice. To stay. Her throat got tight. Not just in the village, he said. With you. Her voice almost broke when she said, that depends. On what? On whether or not you're done hiding. He really looked at her. I'm done. She moved closer and kissed him. It wasn't soft or gentle, it was real and solid, like the ground under their boots. They had a choice, not a dream. They split up right as Whitby's truck pulled into the square. He rolled down the window and said, don't mind me. I'm just here to see history. Nell turned and wiped the smirk off her lips. You're late. Only by a lifetime, he said. The council just called an emergency vote, and Pritchard is stepping down. Sebastian said, stepping down. Whitby grinned and said, more like pushed. That email leak burned clean through him. The Public Trust Committee is getting involved. And Moorcrest. They pulled the whole application. Nell felt her breath leave her body. It's done. Whitby nodded and said, you won. She turned to Sebastian. No, she said softly. We all did. As the church bell rang once, clear and bright, they stood together. The sound echoed through the orchard. It wasn't the end. It was something else. Something is starting. The chapel bells rang once, then twice, and the crowd outside the old stone church fell into a quiet hum of anticipation. The morning sky hung low with a soft silver mist, the kind that blurred the edges of everything and made the world feel gently paused. Inside the chapel, candles flickered against the stained glass, casting warm light over weathered pews, polished wood, and wildflower arrangements gathered from the orchard that now belonged to everyone. Nell fixed the collar of her jacket and felt the hem of her dress brush against the worn stone under her boots. She stood by the archway, taking in the moment. It still didn't seem real. A week ago, she had been alone, holding on to deeds and memories. Now, she was in the middle of something bigger, an orchard that had come back to life, A village that had woken up, and a future that was written not in ink but in shared roots. Sebastian came out of the vestry, brushing some dust off his lapel. His coat was well fitted but simple, and his smile was the kind that came only after you had survived something real. He walked toward her without a title, guards, or legacy pressing against his back. He was just a man walking toward a woman who knew who he was. He asked, "Are you ready?" "I was born ready," she said. He smiled and said, "You're lying." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "But let's do it anyway." The doors swung wide open. The villagers stood up as they came in, not in a line or with a lot of fanfare, but side by side. There was no priest at the altar. Instead, it was Whitby who stepped forward, cleared his throat, and held a worn notebook while blinking back what looked like emotion. "I was asked to speak," he said, "because I'm the only person in this village who has the guts to interrupt either of these two." There was a lot of laughter in the room. He said, but in all seriousness, his voice getting softer, "We're not here for ceremony. We're here to keep a promise. Not just between two people, but between the land, the legacy, and the people who won't let either go without a fight." He looked at Nell and Sebastian and said, "You both stood your ground. You spoke up when it mattered. Now you get to build something new together." Nell didn't cry, but something inside her changed. The past felt full for the first time in a long time, not heavy. Sebastian took a folded piece of paper out of his coat. It was thicker than paper and tied with twine. He turned to the people who had come and said, "Before anything else, we want to share this." He took the twine off and opened it. The Hartley Ashbourne Community Orchard Charter. He put it on the altar and then turned to Nell. They all signed their names at the bottom. People cheered, which was louder than any church organ could have played. After that, the crowd followed them back to the orchard for the first pressing of the season. The old apple press, which had been cleaned and oiled, stood under the open canopy. Kids ran between the trees with baskets, filling them with whatever fruit was left over from the late season. Fire pits crackled, cider brewed over open flame, and laughter rose higher than the smoke. Nell stood by the cider press and watched as the juice flowed into barrels, shining and golden. Sebastian came up next to her and handed her a hot mug. "Cheers to you," he said. She lifted her cup and said, "To us." He said, "To us, again." The new bee path wound through the hedgerows and was lined with lavender, rosemary, and soft wooden signs carved by local schoolchildren. One sign said, "Buzz with purpose," and another said, "The future grows here." They stopped in the middle of the orchard, under the oldest tree, which was twisted, tall, and proud. A simple polished plaque had been nailed to the bark. "This land belongs to the people of Moorcrest, and it always will." Sebastian held her hand. "That was you," he said. "No," she said quietly. "We all did." Lady Imogen's name was already fading from the village's lips a few steps behind them. Pritchard's resignation had been accepted without ceremony. Moorcrest Developments had pulled their application, saying they had unforeseen legal obstructions and revised strategic priorities. No one cried. As night fell, lanterns lit the paths in the orchard. Old songs could be heard from the press barn, where fiddles and clapping hands met. Sebastian danced with Ruth once, but a group of kids pulled him away and made him read the bee poem again. Nell stayed by the fire with her arms crossed and a soft smile on her lips. The orchard came back to life. Not just safe, not only saved, but really awake. Sebastian and Nell walked the rows one last time that night, long after the cider had run out and the songs had settled into the smoke. The moon was full, and the branches above them rustled like they were talking to each other. He asked, "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" "I never thought I'd get a working pump," she said. He laughed and said, "We'll be fine." She held his hand tightly. "More than okay." They stopped at the gate, which still had the old Ashbourne crest on it. It had been polished and restored and was framed by two new posts. Hartley is on one side. On the other hand, Ashbourne. In the middle, there was a single beam of cedar with the words, "Community first, always." He stared at her. "Home?" She nodded. "Home." They went through the gate together. The orchard closed behind them, not as an end but as a beginning written in roots, rain, and the hands that wouldn't let go.